On the morning of September 21st, 1996, 15-year-old Danielle Houchins left her home in Belgrade, Montana. She drove herself. She knew where she was going. Cameron Bridge fishing access, along the Gallatin River, a spot she had visited many times before. Her truck was found parked in the lot. Her keys and a water bottle were left on a nearby path. There was no sign of Danni. That evening, two brothers familiar with the area continued searching after dark, at the urging of one of their children, who was friends with Danni's sister. After about 45 minutes, one of the brothers spotted her. She was lying face down in a shallow pool of water. The autopsy, conducted 2 days later, found muddy material in her stomach and upper and lower airways. A recent laceration in her vagina. Her watch, gold, with an elastic band, pulled partway over her hand, as if she had been dragged by that arm, one former investigator suggested. Her bra was displaced above her breasts. The state medical examiner reviewed all of it, and then he wrote 7 words. Until such time additional information indicates otherwise. The manner of death is undetermined. Not homicide. Not accident. Undetermined. The day after Danni was found, then Sheriff Bill Slaughter told the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, "I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that this may have been an accidental drowning." And with that, a case with sexual assault evidence, displaced clothing, and a 15-year-old girl face down in the mud was handed the quietest possible burial. It would stay that way for almost 28 years, until the morning a man in Dillon, Montana sat across from 2 investigators and confirmed, without being asked, that he knew the name of the road that led to where Danni was found. Who was he? What did investigators miss? And what did they choose not to see? And how does a killer spend 28 years living a quiet, ordinary life, 100 miles from the water where he left a 15-year-old girl to die? That is what this case is about. Danni Houchins had asked her mother that morning for permission to drive to the Cameron Bridge fishing access to blow off some steam. There had been a family disagreement, the kind that happens in ordinary households on ordinary Saturdays. Danni was a frustrated 15-year-old who needed space. She had her license. In Montana in 1996, you could get your driver's license at 15, and by all accounts Danni was a proud driver. She got in her Chevy pickup and left. She never came back. Danni Houchins was a Belgrade high school sophomore. Academically bright, physically active, described by those who knew her as witty, outgoing, and genuinely kind. She was comfortable fishing, hiking, and mountain climbing, an experienced outdoorswoman, even at 15. Her little sister Stephanie was 12 years old that day. Losing Danni was probably the most significant, defining, and informative thing to happen in my entire life, Stephanie would later say. I was 12 years old when Danni was murdered. Note the word she used. Not died. Not passed. Murdered. Stephanie used that word from the beginning because she knew what the autopsy contained. And she knew what the sheriff told the public instead. The family was told that Danni had drowned, that she could have just tripped and fallen, that they really didn't know. As an avid, experienced outdoorswoman, even at 12, Stephanie thought that explanation was absurd. What she didn't know yet, what her family wouldn't fully learn for years, was exactly what that autopsy report contained. The details that had been withheld. The evidence that had been collected, cataloged, and then quietly set aside. One of the real pieces of sensitivity I had and my family had walking into the reinvestigation was the sheer fact that while we thought law enforcement was on our side, they lied to us in 1996 and they withheld information from us, Stephanie said. She was 12. Her sister was dead. And the people who were supposed to find answers were instead deciding how few of them to share. That is where this case begins. Not at the river. Not in the autopsy room. It begins in the space between what investigators knew and what they chose to say. Stephanie would spend the next 24 years trying to heal without answers, to live without resolution, to hope, as she put it, with no reason to hope. She made a promise to Danni. She intended to keep it. What she didn't know in 1996 was how many walls she would have to break through, how many officials would delay, deflect, and deny. How many times the evidence, physical, documented, preserved, would be ignored. And how one man, living 100 miles away, would spend the next 28 years going quietly about his life, believing he had gotten away with it entirely. This is what happened. This is how it was buried. And this is how it was finally, undeniably, brought back into the light. On the morning of September 21st, 1996, Danni was wearing blue jeans and a gray sweatshirt. She had a knee brace on her left knee from an injury she'd gotten weeks earlier at a street dance with friends. That detail matters. Not because it tells us who hurt her, but because it tells us who she was. A 15-year-old with friends, with plans, with a Saturday that was supposed to end the same way it started. At home. When she didn't return, her mother, Cheryl, went looking. She found Danni's truck parked at the fishing access. Unlocked. Empty. The keys and a water bottle were lying in the middle of the trail, a few feet away. Not tucked in a pocket. Not left on a seat. Dropped in the middle of a path. Cheryl immediately knew something was wrong and began frantically searching for her daughter. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and search and rescue were called in. They searched until it became too dark and too dangerous to continue through the wooded, marshy terrain. They stopped. They went home. Danni was still out there. Two brothers who lived nearby and knew the area well continued searching, urged on by one of their children, who was friends with Danni's sister. After about 45 minutes, one of the brothers found her. She was face down, under a willow tree. The position of her body and other evidence at the scene told investigators she had been dragged there and hidden. Let that land for a moment. She was not found where she fell. She was moved, concealed. Someone had taken the time to do that. Danni's body was sent to the Montana State Crime Lab for an autopsy. Evidence of sexual assault was discovered, along with foreign DNA. The autopsy, conducted on September 23rd, found muddy material in her stomach and upper and lower airways. There was a recent laceration in her vagina. Her watch, gold, with an elastic band, was pulled partway over her hand, as if she had been dragged by that arm, one former investigator suggested. Her bra was displaced above her breasts. When Stephanie eventually read that report years later, she described what she found in it. Someone had held her head down forcefully, she said. There were vaginal injuries. There was semen in her underwear. She had fought and scratched. The evidence was there. All of it. Documented. On record. And then came the ruling. State Medical Examiner Gary Dale concluded the cause of death was drowning. The manner of death, he wrote, undetermined. Until such time additional information indicates otherwise, the manner of death is undetermined. Former Detective Cindy Botek, who was just days into her career when Danni's body was found, would later challenge that conclusion directly. People drown all the time, she said. And what's in their body? There's water in their lungs, right? That's what you find. What did we find in Danielle? A stomach full of mud. That doesn't happen in a drowning. Who swallows mud? It is a question that has no innocent answer. 2 days after Danni's body was found, with her family waiting for answers, authorities released partial autopsy findings. They did not say Danni was murdered. The family was told she drowned. That it could have been an accident. That she might have tripped and fallen. Stephanie, 12 years old, sitting in that grief, receiving that explanation about her sister. An experienced hiker, a confident outdoors woman, someone utterly at home in Montana terrain. Absurd, she said later. One word. No hesitation. But absurd or not, that was the official position. And official positions, in small jurisdictions with limited resources and leadership willing to accept the easiest explanation, have a way of becoming permanent. Former Deputy Keith Farquhar, who was on the case in those early weeks, put it plainly. His attitude, from everything I saw, was, "We just want this over with." I don't know what his motivation was, but you shouldn't give up on a homicide of a 15-year-old girl. Farquhar resigned from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office on December 31, 1996, 3 months after Danni died. I have thought about Danni at least every 2 or 3 days for the last 28 years, he said. The case did not close because the evidence ran out. It closed because the people in charge decided it had. Consider what was in that evidence file in September 1996. Foreign DNA. For hairs collected from Danni's body. Semen. Bruising on the back of her neck. A laceration. A watch dragged halfway off her wrist. A body that had been moved and hidden under a tree. None of it went away. It was documented. Preserved. On record. What went away was the will to act on it. Then Sheriff Bill Slaughter told the Bozeman Daily Chronicle the day after Danni was found that the lack of cuts or bruises was worth noting, and that he thought they had to be prepared for the fact that this may have been an accidental drowning. That statement, reported in a named local newspaper, set the tone for everything that followed. 2 former sheriff's office officials with direct ties to the case later criticized Slaughter's office's initial investigation, saying department leadership and lead investigators were too quick to dismiss the death. Slaughter himself has denied deprioritizing the case. The record, and the people who lived inside it, tell a different story. Deputy Keith Farquhar watched it happen in real time. I never felt like that was being pursued in the manner of, somebody killed this girl, and we need to find them, he said. He resigned from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office on December 31, 1996, 3 months after Danni died. Cindy Botek was just days into her law enforcement career when Danni's body was found. She became a detective, and around 2006, a full decade after the murder, she went back into the case file. When she tried to chase new leads, she received pushback from her bosses and was stonewalled by former investigators who had worked on the original case. Think about that for a moment. A detective inside the same department, trying to reopen a case with documented sexual assault evidence, and being pushed back by the institution she worked for. Why? That question has never been fully answered publicly. What is answered, publicly and on record, is what happened as a result. Nothing moved for years. Over the years, there were multiple efforts to get the evidence analyzed by the Montana State Crime Lab. Each time, no usable DNA profile came back. Stephanie later noted that the Montana State Crime Lab had misfiled some of her sister's evidence. Danni's watch, recovered from the scene that night, could not be located at the crime lab at all. Her watch, a piece of physical evidence from the night she died, gone. The family was not kept informed. They had been told she drowned, that it may have been an accident. They were given no detail, no updates, no acknowledgement of what the autopsy actually contained. They lied to us in 1996, and they withheld information from us, Stephanie said. That led to a significant feeling of distrust with the sheriff's department. Stephanie was 12 years old when that distrust was earned. She carried it for the next 23 years. Then in 2019, something shifted. Sheriff's Captain Matt Boxmeyer began reinvestigating the Houchins case. In February 2020, he reached out to Danni's family, knowing that reopening the investigation would reopen wounds that had never properly closed. Boxmeyer later told the family directly what investigators had known all along. Danni's death was not an accident. I shared with them that I believe it was a homicide, he said. For Stephanie, reading the autopsy report for the first time, finally, in full, was not relief. It was rage. I was so angry at the people who lied to my family, she said, and let my sister's murder go unsolved, uninvestigated, for all of these years. That same evidence had already been strong enough, in August 2023, for Sheriff Springer to officially reclassify Danni's manner of death from undetermined to homicide. The reclassification came before anyone had a name. The science was that conclusive. That anger had a target now. But the evidence still had no name attached to it. That was about to change because of 4 hairs, a lab in California, and 1 retired LAPD captain who refused to let a 15-year-old girl stay buried in a file drawer. Dan Springer had been a rookie deputy 5 days into his career when Danny's body was found in 1996. He had carried that with him for 25 years. When he became sheriff, he made a decision. When you become the boss, you get to decide to do things the way you want to do things, he said. I felt like, well, this is our time. Let's go get some answers. He reached outside his department entirely, to a retired Los Angeles Police Department captain named Tom Elfmont, now living near Bozeman and running a global security firm. Elfmont described himself plainly. I'm very persistent. I have a bulldog personality. I just don't give up on something. Springer reached out to Stephanie directly. I am making a promise, he told her, that we will find an answer to this case. Elfmont told her the same. I will solve this case, Stephanie. She said, okay, I'm going to trust you. That exchange between a new sheriff, a retired LAPD captain, and the younger sister of a 15-year-old girl who had been dead for 25 years, is where this case turned. The only reason I stayed in it, Elfmont later said, was Danny. In March 2023, Sheriff Dan Springer and Sheriff's Department Captain Eric Paulson met over lunch with Tom Elfmont, a former Los Angeles Police Department captain who now runs a global security firm and lives full-time near Bozeman. Paulson had heard about Elfmont through a mutual connection. Springer's assessment was direct. I just felt that we needed some fresh eyes on this. Someone with different experience, different knowledge base, and with fresh eyes. Elfmont was sworn in as a special service deputy, with full authority and access to every resource the department had. By mid-2023, Elfmont was working full-time on the case, every day. He went back through all of the evidence, the old suspect list, the case file, the clothing Danny had been wearing when she was found. What he found inside that evidence file had been sitting there since 1996. Documented. Preserved. Waiting. Elfmont asked the Montana State Crime Lab to use their newest technology to retest the semen found on Danny's underwear. At last, a partial DNA profile emerged. But when that profile was run against Cody's, the FBI's nationwide DNA database, there was no match. The killer had never been arrested. His DNA was not in the system. So Elfmont went further. The hairs went to a forensic lab in California. What came back changed everything. In May 2024, nearly 28 years after Danny was killed, they finally had a name. Paul Hutchinson. 9 months earlier, that death had already been reclassified as homicide. Now for the first time, that homicide had a name. Now investigators turned to what they knew about Paul Hutchinson. Rochelle Schrute, a childhood friend of both Danny and Stephanie, had known Paul Hutchinson for nearly 20 years. She had gone on hunting and fishing trips with him, sometimes just the two of them, out in remote terrain. She said she never once questioned his character. Now investigators had his name and his DNA. What they needed next was to sit across from him and watch what happened. What they were not yet certain of was whether they had enough evidence to arrest him. And that uncertainty would shape every decision they made in the next 24 hours. Stephanie Houchins, now Stephanie Mollett, was waiting for a call she had been waiting her entire adult life to receive. During the original investigation, hairs had been recovered from Danny's body. At the time, the technology available could not generate meaningful leads from them. They were rootless hairs, meaning they had no skin cells, no follicle tissue attached. For decades, that had made them effectively useless for DNA analysis. That was no longer true. Sue Moore, the chief genealogist who would ultimately crack this case, put it precisely. In that original physical evidence was rootless hair, and that was what ended up enabling us to perform investigative genetic genealogy. Astrea Forensics, based in California, developed a SNP profile, a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, from the hair evidence recovered from Danny's body. This transformed previously unusable material into actionable genetic data. A profile built not from a database match, not from a known suspect sample, but from a strand of hair left at a crime scene in 1996 that the science of 1996 simply could not read. That partial DNA profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's nationwide law enforcement DNA database. No matches were found. Paul Hutchinson had never been arrested. His DNA was not in any criminal database. Traditional forensic methods had reached their limit, so the profile went somewhere else. The DNA was then sent to Parabon NanoLabs in Virginia to try to solve the crime through forensic genetic genealogy. Here is what that process involves, and why it changes everything traditional forensics cannot reach. Genetic genealogy takes an unknown suspect's DNA left at a crime scene and identifies it using family members who have voluntarily submitted DNA samples to genealogy databases. Law enforcement can then build a much larger family tree than if they used only databases like CODIS. The genealogist is not looking for the killer directly. They are looking for his relatives, cousins, second cousins, distant branches of a family tree, and then working methodically inward from those connections until the branches converge on one person. Moore described the process clearly. We are almost always working with very distant relatives when we are working with investigative genetic genealogy to identify a violent criminal, and it is almost never just one match that leads us to him. In this case, the work led somewhere precise. In this case, Moore said, I was able to connect to all four of Paul Hutchinson's grandparents. 4 grandparental lines, confirmed through public genealogy databases. That is not a suggestion. That is not a probability. That is a genealogical map with one name at the center. The name was Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson, 55 years old, Dillon, Montana. Who was Paul Hutchinson? In 1996, Hutchinson had been a student at Montana State University in Bozeman, less than 13 miles from the Cameron Bridge fishing access where Danni was killed. He later graduated in fisheries wildlife biology. He then worked for the Montana Bureau of Land Management for 22 years as a fisheries biologist, a career built entirely around rivers, waterways, and the outdoors of rural Montana. He had no criminal history, no traffic violations. He was married with 2 adult children, respected in local hunting and fishing circles, a familiar face in Dillon, 22 years of federal service. The last person anyone in that community would have looked at. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office later described what investigators believed had happened on September 21, 1996. Hutchinson, then a Montana State University student, had randomly encountered Danni at the river. They had no prior connection. Investigators characterized it as a crime of opportunity. He was not someone who had known her, not someone who had planned it, not someone with a history that pointed toward violence. He was a graduate student who encountered a 15-year-old girl at a remote fishing access site and made a decision that cost her life. Then he went back to his studies, finished his degree, built a career, and kept living. For 28 years. July 23, 2024. Dillon, Montana. Tom Elfmont and Sergeant Court Deepweg drove 140 miles south from Bozeman to Hutchinson's office at the Bureau of Land Management, body cameras rolling. They had a DNA profile that pointed to Hutchinson. They did not yet have a confirmed match to evidence from Danni's body. They could not arrest him. Under Montana law, any voluntary contact had to take place in a public space where he could walk away at any time. They needed him to stay. And they needed something from him, ideally his DNA, or at minimum a reaction that would later inform the record. They saw Hutchinson arrive at the BLM lot and climb out of his pickup. Elfmont walked up to within about 10 feet of him. He said, "Hey Paul, how are you doing?" Then, "My name's Tom Elfmont. I'm with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office." He turned white. Investigators came prepared with a pretext, telling Hutchinson they wanted to talk to him about some things that had been going on at the rivers in southwest Montana, framing it as a routine fisheries consultation. Hutchinson invited them inside. "You guys want to come inside and talk?" Deepweg said. "That'd be great, man." Elfmont noted the significance immediately. "If he invites us in, we don't have to give him Miranda. So we go inside. He takes us in a small conference room. The body camera was running. Hutchinson sat across from them. He didn't know what they had. He didn't know about the hairs. He didn't know about Parabon NanoLabs, or Susomore, or the genealogy work that had traced 4 grandparental lines back to his name. They didn't mention Danni right away. Deepweg opened. "So, I appreciate you sitting down with us." Hutchinson replied, "No, glad to help." "Wow, what's up?" Elfmont said that even before they reached the subject of Danni, Hutchinson broke into a sweat, just his head, visibly sweating. Within minutes, he asked if he could leave. Can you give me a second?" Deepweg said, "Absolutely." Hutchinson said he needed to help a co-worker and stepped away. He came back. Elfmont then placed photographs on the table. Pictures of 4 women who had died. 1 in a river in Idaho, 2 on the Yellowstone, and then Danni. Deepweg took over. He showed Hutchinson a photograph of Danni. "Okay, this is Danielle Houchins. She was killed in September of '96. Hutchinson said, "Okay." Deepweg continued. "And she was found off the Gallatin River. Did you ever fish up there?" Hutchinson replied, "I trapped on the Gallatin." Deepweg asked, "Have you ever heard of the Cameron Bridge access?" Hutchinson nodded. He said yes. Twice. He had not just confirmed knowledge of the general area. He had confirmed unprompted that he knew the specific access site, and as Elfmont later stated, he remembered the name of the street that led there. Elfmont watched from across the table. He's shaking. He's all distressed now. He was sitting back in the chair, as far as he could get from the table and the pictures. "I knew we had him." Deepweg pushed further. He asked if there was any possibility Hutchinson had been present when Danni was murdered. Hutchinson said, "No." He was asked if he had been trapping in that area in September. He said, "Not in September." He denied seeing Danni there. Even when Deepweg told him directly that investigators had the suspect's DNA, Hutchinson said no. He denied it. Sitting in that chair, as far back from the photographs as he could get, he said no. As the interview concluded, Hutchinson had a question of his own. "Anything else you want to ask me while I'm here?" Elfmont was later asked by CBS News correspondent Peter Van Sant whether he had ever directly asked Hutchinson if he killed Danni Houchins. Elfmont said, "No." Van Sant asked why. Elfmont replied, "Didn't need to." Van Sant said, "Because he knows that you know." Elfmont said, "That's right." Van Sant, "And you know that he knows that you know." Elfmont, "Correct." They released him. They still did not have enough for an arrest. The confirmed DNA match, the one that would lock it closed, still had to be obtained through legal process. They began working on how to get it. They would not need to. Early the next morning, July 24, 2024, Paul Hutchinson called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office. He said he needed assistance. Then he hung up. Deputies found him on the side of a road. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 55 years old. Less than 12 hours had passed since he had sat across from Tom Elfmont and said the word no. In the days following Hutchinson's death, DNA was collected from his remains and matched against the evidence recovered from Danni's body in 1996. Sheriff Springer called it 100% confirmation that Hutchinson was the killer. He never stood trial. He was never charged. He answered with his silence in that room, and then he answered again, permanently, on the side of a road in Dillon before dawn. For Stephanie Mollett, who had been waiting for 28 years, that was the moment. Not a verdict. Not a sentencing. Not a courtroom. A phone call from Tom Elfmont telling her that the man was dead, and that the DNA confirmed everything she had always known. There would be no jury. No testimony. No moment where his name was read aloud beside hers in a courtroom, before a judge, on the record. "I guess I was relieved that it wasn't someone who was close to my family," Stephanie said. "It wasn't someone where we'd not only have to deal with everything that goes along with solving your sister's homicide case, but also that feeling of betrayal if it was Danni's friend, or a family friend or community member. Relief. That a stranger killed her sister. That is what 28 years does to a family. August 8, 2024. Bozeman, Montana. A press conference podium. A sheriff. A family. And 28 years of waiting compressed into a single morning. Sheriff Springer told reporters, "Montana has very strict individual rights laws, and at the moment that we interviewed him, we did not have confirmation that that was his DNA." Then he said something that has no comfortable place to land. He confirmed it before we actually got the confirmation when he took his own life. Paul Hutchinson, a man who said no across a conference room table, answered the actual question on the side of a road in Dillon before dawn. In the absence of a trial, his suicide became the only verdict this case would ever have. Stephanie Mollett stood at that podium and said, "After nearly 28 years without answers, without justice, we celebrate today." She used the word celebrate. But listen to what came directly after it. "Even though this man will not face a jury of his peers, I have no doubt he was the one who forcefully and violently sexually assaulted my sister, then held her head down in a marsh until she choked to death on mud. When the time came to face up and account for his violence, he instead chose to end his life. He knew of his guilt and couldn't face my family or his family and the pain he had caused. That is not a celebration. That is 28 years of grief, of rage, of an unanswered promise, compressed into 2 minutes at a microphone. No trial, no cross-examination, no moment where his name was formally placed alongside hers in a courtroom on the public record before a jury of 12 people. He denied it to investigators' faces. Then he made sure no one could ever make him say it again. And then Stephanie did something that no one in that room expected. She thanked Tom Elfmont. She thanked Sheriff Springer. And then she unleashed years of pent-up anger at the institution that had failed Danni from the very first night. The sheriff lied to my parents, bold-faced lied and betrayed the trust of shocked and grieving parents. Those institutions failed my sister, failed my family, and failed this community." CBS News asked Sheriff Springer directly whether her family had been lied to. He said, I don't know what they said, to be honest." That non-answer, on camera, at a press conference called to announce justice, says something the department has never formally addressed. Rochelle Schrute watched the announcement from wherever she was. She had known Paul Hutchinson for nearly 20 years. She had trusted him, gone into remote terrain with him. As she heard his name announced, she said, "I am gutted. I've known him most of my life. It makes me mad to know him. How dare you? How dare you just exist and go on to have a family and a career, when you knew all along what you had done?" And then there was Christy Hutchinson, his wife of 24 years. She posted a statement on the funeral home's website on August 8th, the same day the sheriff made his announcement, replacing the obituary that had already been briefly published. "We are absolutely heartbroken to learn this news, and our hearts go out to the Houchins family. It is good to know that they will at last be able to find the closure that they deserve. Our own family was already reeling from dealing with Paul's suicide. In 24 years of marriage, there was never any hint that something like this could be lurking in the background. Paul was an exceptional husband and father. This latest news makes our grieving so much more complicated. We would appreciate being given the space to process and come to terms with this development as we mourn." 2 women, 2 statements, both true. Neither won the whole picture. Christy Hutchinson lost a husband she believed she knew. Her children lost a father who concealed from them, for their entire lives, what he had done at 27 years old on a Saturday afternoon in September. They are, as Sheriff Springer said publicly, also victims of this man. And Stephanie Mollett lost 28 years. Lost them to a single word written by a medical examiner who had every piece of evidence in front of him. "Montanans, Danielle's story should anger you," Stephanie said. "Should make you think about your mothers, your sisters, your wives, and your daughters. Should make you think about everything you would do to protect and honor the women you love." The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office confirmed the case is closed, but that an investigation into Paul Hutchinson's life remains ongoing, specifically to determine whether there are other victims. That investigation has produced no public findings to date, which means the question that Stephanie has lived with since she was 12 years old has been answered, but not entirely. There is a name now. There is a DNA match. There is a confirmed manner of death, 27 years late. What there is not, and what there never will be, is a trial, a full accounting, a moment where the system that failed Danni in 1996 was forced to reckon with that failure in public, under oath, with consequences attached. That absence is the final wound in this case, and it belongs not just to the Houchins family, but to every case still sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, classified not as murder, but as undetermined. Danni Houchins was 15 years old. She drove herself to a river on a Saturday morning in September 1996, in a place she knew. She never made it home. The man who took her life spent the next 28 years going to work, submitting his reports, raising his children, trapping and fishing the rivers of rural Montana. He had been living beneath law enforcement's radar, about 100 miles southwest of the crime scene, until new forensic DNA technology and a genetic genealogist finally connected him to Danni. Because one word in one medical examiner's report gave him the gift of time. The word was undetermined. "I was a child in 1996, Stephanie said. "It shouldn't have taken my diligence and resolve to solve this case." She is right, and that truth does not soften with the passage of time. A 12-year-old girl was told her sister probably drowned accidentally. She grew into a woman who spent the next 27 years making phone calls, reading autopsy reports she was never supposed to see, and refusing to accept a word that was never accurate. She is the reason this case moved. Not the system. Not the institution. Stephanie Mollett. "I celebrate that my fight for my sister is over," she said. "We have honored Danni's memory with justice." Sheriff Springer, for his part, was measured. "I think in any investigation, there's always going to be something you wish you'd done differently," he said. But by the same token, this was solved by technology that was nowhere even near available at the time. It's saddening that it took 28 years, but we got to where we needed to get. That is true, and it is also insufficient. The DNA technology that solved this case did not exist in 1996. The institutional will to pursue it as a homicide, when every piece of physical evidence pointed to exactly that did. "Accountability to me is not necessarily about the individual," Stephanie said, "but it's about the institution, and making the institution better so it doesn't fail other victims of rape and murder. That is the ask. Not punishment. Not a public reckoning with names and consequences attached. An institution that, the next time a 15-year-old girl is found face down in shallow water with foreign DNA and displaced clothing and mud in her airways, does not reach for the word undetermined. The investigation into Danni's case is now closed. But law enforcement confirmed it is looking into Paul Hutchinson's life and possible connections to other cold cases. No public findings have been released. No other victims have been formally named. That investigation remains open and unresolved. It took 4 preserved hairs, a lab in California, a genealogist who traced 4 grandparental lines to one name, a retired LAPD captain who worked the case full-time because, as he put it, the only reason he stayed was Danni, and a new sheriff who made a promise to a family that had been lied to and kept it. All of that, to replace one word with another. Undetermined. To homicide. Danni Houchins deserved the second word in 1996. She deserved it from the night her body was found under a willow tree, face down, moved and hidden, in a place she had driven to freely on a Saturday morning. She got it 27 years late. And the question that this case leaves behind, the one with no comfortable answer, the one that belongs not just to Gallatin County, but to every jurisdiction that has ever reached for the easiest explanation when the hardest one was right there in the evidence file, is this: how many cases like Danni's are still sitting somewhere, classified not as murder, but as undetermined? Stephanie Mollett is still watching.